Thank you very much, Dr. Hemachandran, for this very warm and kind words of introduction. And my apologies to all of you for not showing up last week. I got into some other commitment I couldn't really wriggle out of. And Dr. Hemachandran actually has been, this has been a very long-standing invitation. He told me some 2 years ago that he would like me to come and speak here before some of you, but I really couldn't figure out if I had, what I could say, if I had anything to say at all, that is. And it just struck me only 3-4 weeks back that the population census, the India's population census of 2021 is fast approaching, and therefore I thought, since this is a course on disabilities Dr. Hemachandran is offering, so I thought it might be of some relevance, to share, what little I know of the census and the intervention on as regards disabilities, which was just fortuitous because I happened to be around during the 2001 census. Now, I don't know how many of you are actually, have experienced the previous census. I assume that in the 2001 census, many of you probably weren't even born, or even those of you who were around must have been very small. So is there anybody here who remembers anything about the 2011 census? Those of you who have some knowledge of it, please say yes. Yes. And others who don't have any experience of the 2011 census, please say no. No. Super. So can I assume that the majority of you did not have much to do with the 2011 census, right? That's a fair assumption to make. So I feel somewhat vindicated in in trying to speak on this subject today. So let me begin by saying that India's mammoth February 2021 decennial population census, the nation's largest demographic exercise and among the world's largest, is barely months away. This afternoon, I want to argue why it is paramount that the 2021 operation should capture data on every type of impairment recognized under the 2016 law on disabilities. Besides enabling the enforcement of that law, both in letter and in spirit, such an exercise would be crucial to India realizing the disability-specific targets under the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. But first, allow me to say something about the gigantic census operations that have been going on in India for a long time. So this country-wide exercise has been held almost uninterrupted once every 10 years since 1872, between the 8th and the 28th of February. I think it's from the 10th to the 28th of February. In these 20 days, the government compiles a profile of the country's population. Each single person who happens to be staying anywhere on the Indian soil, citizens and foreigners alike, is covered for this purpose. Typically, census enumerators visit various households categorized under 3 distinct heads, and they are tasked with filling out an elaborate questionnaire containing, say, about 20-25 questions. We'll come to that in a while. So I'm telling you something about the census operation only to emphasize the fact that disabilities have not been enumerated in India for a very long time. And you should understand, it's useful for you to understand why this exclusion has happened and what are the implications of that. Now, so what is the kind of information that is gathered in a census? A variety of information is gathered from what are called normal households. The term normal households refers to the number of persons who live in an ordinary family, like all of us, like many of us. So the individual profile of each person is gathered, that is the age of a person, his or her gender particulars, his or her caste identity, if he or she happens to belong to the scheduled caste or the scheduled tribes, a person's educational attainments, somebody's vocational and employment status, a person's annual income, his or her marital status, his or her religious orientation, and the types of household amenities in their possession, whether people have vehicles, for example, what type of vehicles are owned by the members of a household, whether you own bicycles, whether you own two-wheelers, whether you own cars, and so on and so forth, and whether people have access to electricity, whether people have access to water supply and toilets, among so many other such data is gathered from what are called normal households. Now, similar data is also obtained from institutional households. Now, what are institutional households? This term refers to people living in institutions such as boarding schools, homes for the aged, orphanages, patients admitted to hospitals, and the population living in prisons. So all of these are called people who live in these residential accommodation, non-family residential accommodation, if you like to call it, these are categorized as institutional households for the purpose of the census. Then there's a third census category where information is gathered from a third category of people, which is called the houseless households. It seems a bit of a paradox to call this, but the term refers to the large houseless population that dwells on footpaths, in the slums, on bus stands, on railway platforms, and what have you. Coverage under these three categories is known as the population enumeration phase, and which is done with the use of household schedules. Kimshuk, can you please show slide 2, please? Yes. So this slide talks about your normal households. The information gathered in all these categories is the same, from the normal households, from institutional households, from institutional households, and houseless households. So these are the three categories under which this enumeration happens, and information sought and obtained from the respondents is pretty much the same. So the population census is a massive nation building activity in at least two very distinct respects. Now you would appreciate that what do we do with all this information gathering and why it is done. I'm saying that this is a massive nation building exercise in two very distinct respects. First, the data thrown up by the census forms the basis for the determination of electoral constituencies for the Lok Sabha, for the state assemblies, and for elections to local bodies. You would recall that the number of Lok Sabha constituencies has steadily risen since the first general elections of 1952, corresponding to the increase in the population in a geographical location. So, this is the first sense in which it is a nation building exercise. This is the data gathered is helpful, is one of the factors that goes into the determination of electoral constituencies. And secondly, India, as all of you know, is a welfare state, and the government gathers, and the government's socio-economic programs are drawn up on the basis of the specific needs of targeted populations in various states. This background about the sheer scale, about the operation of the census is essential to understand the importance of the enumeration of disabilities or its omission from the decennial population census. Can we have the next slide, please? So again, in this slide, we are talking about in what ways the census is a nation building exercise. I'm sure it is pretty obvious to all of you, isn't it? That because this information, it's only on the basis of knowing how many people are there in each city or in each ward or in each locality, the electoral constituencies are determined. And again, in relation to the welfare programs that we have, we have the Narega, the Manrega rather, we have the public distribution system, and you have the Sarva Siksha Abhiyan. So all these programs are designed, are targeted at specific population groups, based on knowledge, information about the concentration of population, the kinds, the people who live, what are their socio-economic profiles, and that is the basis on which it is decided. And this slide also talks about the largest constituency in India, and that is as per the 2011 census. This is the Malkazgiri constituency in Hyderabad, which is now in Telangana, and the smallest electoral constituency is in Lakshadweep. This is as per the 2011 census. Now, if you look at the preceding census data, you will surely find that the largest constituency has from time to time varied from place to place or state to state. So these are the two respects in which your census is a nation building exercise. And again, I am saying all this to subsequently draw a comparison with the enumeration or the non-enumeration of disabilities. Now it happens that the 2001 census was the first instance since independence that persons with disability, that person's disability status was captured in India's population enumeration programs. In purely technical, I'm saying 2001 was the first time that disability was enumerated in the census. But purely in technical terms, I'm saying the 2001 census was in fact the second instance. Now, why this is so is because a small number of impairments were enumerated in 1981. 1981, the government was mandated to include the relevant question on disability because that happened to be the International Year of Persons with Disabilities. That was 1981. So the government decided that we must enumerate disabilities. They did so in a very limited sense. But again, come 1991 census, the disability question was promptly dropped from the census. So the question was predictably dropped, I am saying, from the 1991 census is because I am saying it was predictable because the omission of this question became a pattern ever since India's independence in 1947. Curiously, the colonial administration took account of the disabled in the country, albeit in a limited manner, in every enumeration from 1872. Now, can you do slide, the next slide please? Is this slide about Mr. Javed Abidi and Dr. Chandramouli or no?
No, sir.
Right. So basically, I'm saying that how, prior to independence, disabilities were canvassed, but only in a very limited sense, at least they were canvassed. But post-independence, in 51, in 61, in 1971, there was no disability count taken. The disability status was not included. 81, it was done. 91, it was promptly dropped. Can anybody in the anybody here volunteer or speculate as to why disabilities would have been dropped in the post-independence census? After all, post-independence, India was decidedly following a very rationalist, modernist path. Nehru was the supreme leader. He was an avowed nationalist, rationalist, modernist. But yet, why do you think the disability question suddenly disappears and very consciously disappears through successive censuses from 1951? Any guesses? Partition violence. Interesting. Anything else? Sorry?
They just decided nobody was disabled.
Nobody was disabled. That's very interesting. Anyway, good. And one more, please. I never thought of all of this. Any more?
So they didn't want to publicly acknowledge that they have this issue also to address. They didn't want to focus on this particular aspect. There were other issues they thought merited more attention at that point in time.
You mean to say the government thought there were more important issues to consider, or are you saying that they were embarrassed to acknowledge this?
They did not want to publicly acknowledge it, and so that they didn't want to use the resources here, rather they wanted to use it somewhere else.
Right.
Probably it is also not a significant identity vote bank.
Very interesting. I think there's a bit of I think it's closer to the truth to say that this is not a priority. This is not the government's priority. But why this wasn't a priority is a key thing. Now, I am saying, and many have been saying during the census enumeration campaigns that I was part of during the 2001 census, and these are the reasons I'm listing here. So the reasons why the issue of disability did not feature in the decennial census in free India are not very hard to conjecture. First, given prevailing deep-seated social stigma and stereotypes on disabled people, it was thought that families would not be forthcoming to divulge such sensitive information. In view of the real and perceived implications from such disclosures, implications for the social standing of families, especially the marital prospects of the able-bodied siblings of families with disabled children, there was a lot of reluctance. The government thought people will be unwilling to talk about it, which is not really far from the truth. I mean, when a Sarkari Naukar goes to the a house and says, is there a disabled person in this house? Especially if there are girls with disabilities, families would hesitate, and they would say, they may not even, be honest and truthful and say, yes, this is the situation and what kind of disability and so on and so forth. So this was the, given the stereotypes and the the stigma around disability, it was, logical to think that, people will not talk about it. But then, for a government official, for a government to decide that therefore we shall not even talk about it, becomes a problem. And that is exactly what happened, not in one census, not in two, but three, or even longer. Now, the very interesting thing is, this was the logic that was preponderant, the logic that we were talking about a little while ago. This was the preponderant kind of reasoning, notwithstanding the fact that there was a guarantee of strict confidentiality under the census law. It guarantees confidentiality of the data obtained from individuals. You have the Census Act of India, which very clearly says that, the information that is gathered from households, from individuals, shall not be disclosed to anybody else. You can't access this information even in a court of evidence, whether in civil or criminal proceedings. You cannot access this information. You can use this information only as a broad statistical trend. The trends about disability, the regional trends, district variations, and so on and so forth, not just about disability, about anything. Broad trends you can use to formulate policy, but you can't hold any individual to account because of the kind of houses he owns, the kind of property he has, or the vehicles he owns, or the number of children he has. This is nobody's business as far as the census law is concerned. But despite these guarantees of privacy and confidentiality, disability is not included in the census, right? And interestingly, even after such information is not available, even under the Right to Information Act. The information that is gathered in the census is not available, period. Only broad trends. You can't get information about me or vice versa, or I can't gather information from the census data about you, any one of you here. So I guess we can move on from there. So this is the background up till the 1990s. The 1995 Persons with Disabilities, Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation Act influenced an alternative narrative on disabilities both within and outside the government. The new law, that is the 1995 law, this is the first law on disabilities in India. You had the National Trust Act, but that just was limited to, the issue of mental health. That was in the 1990s. So we are talking about the 1995 Act. So this new law recognized 7 impairments: blindness, low vision, leprosy cured, hearing impairment, locomotor disability, mental retardation, and mental illness. So these are the 7 disabilities that are recognized under the 1995 law. To state the obvious, the absence of hard numbers on each of the above heads rendered meaningless the lofty goals of the law on equal opportunities and to remove non-discrimination. What do you do with your equal opportunities provisions or non-discrimination provisions if you don't even have reliable numbers, accurate numbers, even ballpark numbers you do not have on disabilities or the nature of disabilities? What do you do with this law? So therefore, the 2001 census was a rare moment to address that lacuna, and the government decided to canvass a question on disabilities. And can we have the next slide, please? Now, this is a slide on Javed Abidi and Chandramouli, right?
I think it's 2 slides after that.
Oh, right, okay, sorry. So this is about the new law.
Yeah.
So here we are talking about the 7 disabilities that are recognized in the 1995 law. As I mentioned, blindness, low vision, leprosy cured, people with locomotor disabilities, mental retardation, and mental illness. So these are the disabilities that are recognized in the 1995 law. We have moved very far from that in 2019, and we shall come to that in a while. So from October 2000, this is after the government decides that we are going to canvass disability in the 2001 census. So from October 2000, the National Center for the Promotion of Employment for Disabled People spearheaded a mass all India campaign to raise public awareness on the stakes involved in the next census. The Office of the Registrar General of India, that is the government agency in charge of the conduct of census, undertook elaborate training programs to sensitize enumerators about the wider significance of canvassing the question on disability. The 2011 census canvassed the issue more widely than in 2001, and we may be reasonably confident that the process is now irreversible. Now here I want to show the next slide, please. Now here I want to remember 2 very eminent people who have set a great example to this country as regards canvassing disabilities is concerned. One is a person with disabilities and other is an able-bodied normal person. The disabled person I am talking about is Mr. Javed Abidi, late Javed Abidi, who passed away last March 4th. He was a man on a wheelchair. He studied his master's in the United States. He studied journalism, and then he worked briefly with the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation in the early 1990s, and then he set up this National Center for Promotion of Employment for Disabled People. Are we on the right slide, Kimshuk?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Super. So, he set up this campaign, this organization called the NCPEDP in 1996, and the 2001 census was a pioneering moment in Indian disability history when he spearheaded, Mr. Javed Abidi spearheaded the campaign with the government to enumerate disabilities, that unless you do this, you can't really enforce your disability law that you have enacted, Parliament enacted in 1995. From the side of the government was again my very good friend Dr. C. Chandramouli. He was my senior in college here in Madras Loyola College at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. He joined the Indian Administrative Service in 1985. He was the Census Commissioner for the state of Tamil Nadu. And once the government decided that we are going to canvass disabilities, government officials are trained actually to, how to conduct the census, how to go about canvassing these questions, how to fill up these questionnaires, and what kind of information they need to gather and why they need to gather. Basically, these are elaborate training programs the government organizes, and Dr. Chandramouli organized several workshops within Tamil Nadu, and I was privileged to be part of some of these as a resource person to tell enumerators, these are government employees drawn from different government departments, school teachers and what have you, to say that you must gather this information on disability. It is so very important. This was Chandramouli's own initiative, and in 2011, when Dr. Chandramouli was the Registrar General of India, he took an all India campaign to greater heights to do this campaign in a more in-depth manner. And so these are the 2 if you want to put faces to this campaign, I think there are many people who have done this, but I think these two are very important individuals we might want to remember. Let's move on from here. Time does not permit us to engage in a detailed analysis of the 2001 disability data or the civil society response to the modest figures that were thrown up in 2001. However, it may be more fruitful to engage in a decadal comparison between the 2001 and the 2011 findings and tease out some of the larger implications. About 2.21% of India's population is disabled, says the 2011 population figures. 2.21% of India's population is disabled. In absolute numbers, that comes down to 2.68 crore persons, right? The 2001 numbers put people with disabilities at 2.13% for the total population. So there's an increase from 2.13 in 2001 to 2.21% in the 2011 census. Please note the 0.8% decadal increase in the share of the disabled population relative to the overall population in the 10 years between 2001 and 2011. So just remember this 2.21% is India's disabled population as per 2011. Okay. Now I want to say that I want to contrast this with a different set of figures. Now, in 2011, the World Bank and the World Health Organization, they came out with a report in 2011. This is the first report of its kind. It says that there are over 1 billion people who are disabled one way or the other in the world. That is the global figure. It says there are over 1 billion people. And moreover, as many as 80% of disabled people live in developing countries, says the United Nations Development Program. So about 80% of disabled people live in developing countries. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that the 2011 census says you have 2.21% of disabled people, the population has a disability. But this is in a major way, this percentage is at variance with estimates from other international organizations. Now, it's not very difficult to extrapolate that if you have 80% of disabled people living in developing countries, you can just imagine what must be the proportion of disabled people in each country. We are not saying that it will be some 15 or 20% or whatever. Probably it is, we don't know. But it will be safe to assume that surely it cannot be merely 2.21% of disabled people population. The figures in India should be far higher than what we have just now from the 2011 census of 2.21%. So therefore, on this reckoning, anywhere between 8 to 10% of a developing country's population has some disability or the other. For our purposes this afternoon, the obvious concern is the discrepancy between what these global estimates suggest and what our population census suggests. Now, the answer should be equally obvious as we shall presently consider. Now, there has been a huge 2.4% jump in the disabled population in the decade from 2001 to 2011. Now I'm dropping the international comparison. Let's forget about that for the moment. We have again reverted back to the India census 2001 and 2011, and the decadal increase in the population of disabled people is somewhere in the region of 22.4%. Now we must try to find out why there has been such a huge jump. The hike in the disabled population from 2001 to 2011 is underpinned by a slight increase among both sexes in in this period, and the proportion of the disabled is higher among males. Fair enough, right? Let us consider. I am offering you the following plausible explanation for the substantial increase in numbers obtained in the last two census. Can we have the next slide, please? This slide is about?
Which one do you want? So there is one on increase in
Sorry?
population. The reasons for increase.
Yes.
The one is 2016 disability law.
No. We are talking about the reasons for.
Okay.
So to begin with, the 2011 census, the 2011 census gathered data on as many as 8 types of disabilities, as against 5 in 2001. In 2001, we had only 5 disabilities that were canvassed. The 5 formerly canvassed impairments were those in seeing, in hearing. That's in 2001. In 2001, the disabilities taken up for enumeration were seeing, hearing, in speech, in movement, and in mental disability. The two new additions in the 2011 census were multiple disabilities, and there was this new category that was introduced in 2011, any other category. Now just imagine you go to somebody's house and you talk about whether people have this XYZ disability. Okay, you don't have XYZ or ABC, but you have any other disability. So the respondent is free to disclose any other disability that is not among this list. So this is one big factor why the number of disabilities might have increased, because people are not restricted to identifying any one of these disabilities. If they had other disabilities, say for example multiple disabilities or thalassemia or something else, they were free to say disclose that as under the any other category. So then that is one reason. The any other category, that was a major factor, I think. The category of mental disability was refined to this is in 2011. The category of mental disability was refined to introduce mental retardation and mental illness as 2 distinct categories. Now when you differentiate between mental retardation and mental illness, obviously that's going to again make people think and say, a lot of people may feel they don't have mental retardation exactly, but mental illness is something many people are willing to acknowledge, and they do have an issue there. So the any other option was an open invitation to respondents to declare impairments that were not legally recognized in the 1995 law. Importantly, many of them may well be those included in the 2007 Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that India ratified in 2007. Another potential reason could also be because the question on persons with disabilities, the question on the status of disability was moved up from 15 in the 2001 census to question number 9 in the 2011 census. No, I was telling you there are about some 25 questions in a census questionnaire. So, I told you, people's, their age, their personal particulars, their social profile, their economic profile, and the amenities they use, the utilities they can afford, the vehicles they own, and so many other such questions are there. The kind of work that they do, whether they are main workers or marginal workers and what have you. So, when you have a long list of questionnaire, if the disability question is way down, say 20 or so, whether you like it or not, although it doesn't imply a ranking, or probably it does, you lose interest, people don't necessarily pay same attention, consistently all the way through. So, the question that was moved up from question number 15 in 2001 to question 9 in 2011 could have been again a very major factor. So, as per the 2011 census, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat and some of the northeastern states have among the lowest percentage of disabled people to the overall population. Conversely, Jammu and Kashmir and some states in central India have a 2.51 and more percentage of disabled people to the total population. Note that this 2.51 plus figure is way above the national percentage, which is 2.21. That's for the 2011 census I am saying. The higher proportions in the latter latter regions. Any guesses again why in some of these states there are people more with disabilities, plausible reasons I am saying, and why in some states there are fewer disabled people? Any guesses again? Broadly.
Level of awareness.
No, I'm saying, sorry?
Violence?
Okay.
Like Jammu and Kashmir could be because of terrorism and violence.
That leads to disabilities, definitely I agree with you. Any other factor? Why there are fewer people? Jammu and Kashmir there are more, you are saying violence is a plausible explanation. But there are states like Tamil Nadu, Gujarat and some other states where the proportion is smaller to the overall population.
Access to healthcare.
Absolutely. You see, the question of disability is always linked to, disability is as much a development issue as anything else. Combating, trying to, reducing poverty, eliminating hunger, lowering or maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates, child mortality rates, better enrollment in schools, greater enrollment of girls in schools. All these are development issues, right? Similarly, disability is also a major development issue, although it is slowly but surely coming to be recognized for what it is. So, definitely where the overall human development indicators are stronger in those regions, it stands to reason that the incidence of disabilities is at least somewhere lesser than in many of the states where these very essential human development indicators are very, very weak in some of these states. So, that is what it is. Now, the proportion of orthopedically impaired, Preeti was just mentioning that people with locomotor impairments form the largest proportion of disabled people in the world. A little while ago she was saying that, and I think the Indian census corroborates that. The proportion of orthopedically impaired at 20.3% is the highest among the overall disabled population as per the 2011 census. Now, this is followed by impairments in hearing 18.9% and in vision 18.8%. Now, the multiply disabled at 7.9% form another large proportion to the total disabled population as per the 2011 census. Census 2011 also shows a steady increase in the proportion of disabled across different age groups. This is very significant. For instance, in the 0 to 4 age group, the proportion is 1.14%. And in the 5 to 9 age group, it is 1.54%. Again, the difference between the above two figures may well reflect timely or delayed screening and diagnosis of various conditions in our country. The distribution, likewise, the distribution of the disabled in the 90 plus age group is as much as 8.40%, right? Much higher than the overall percentage, reflecting what does it show among the 90 plus age group, reflecting many geriatric conditions, as well as the option to declare any other disability besides those listed in the census schedule. We just talked a little while ago about this new option that was introduced, to say any other option, any other disability. So that would have definitely been a factor why many people, especially in the higher age groups, would have declared many other disabilities apart from what is there in the census list. Notably, the increase in disabilities is significantly steep right from 50 to 60 year age group. But I think the most shocking manifestation of the lag among the disabled as per the last census is in the domain of education. The rate of literacy, the rate of literacy among disabled people is a meager 15% as compared to the overall rate of 74.04% for the general population. Among disabled, it is only 15%, whereas for the general population, it is 74%. This is the highest literacy rate recorded in independence India for the general population. That was in the 2011 census. The total rural literacy rate was 68%, and in urban areas, it was 84%. This for the general population. Now, the roughly 10 percentage point jump in 2011 for the general population makes the comparison all the more stark. For the general population, the literacy rate jumped from the 60s to the mid 70s in about 10 years. Furthermore, the rate of literacy among the disabled up to matriculation and secondary school was 3.5%, and for graduation and above, it was 1.25%. Then attainments below primary level was some 2.8% as per the 2011 census. Now, this scenario echoes the assessment of the United Nations Education Cultural, the UNESCO Education, Social and Cultural Organization. Now, the UNESCO estimates that in developing countries, 90%, according to the UNESCO, some 90% of people with disabilities in the developing world do not attend school. The global literacy rate for adults with disabilities was as low as 3% and 1% for women with disabilities according to a 1998 UNDP study. Now, the above disaggregated data, in particular those pertaining to educational attainments, highlight the many perils of the prolonged neglect of disabilities from the Indian census exercise. I am saying these figures that we have now in the 2011 census at least tell us what a huge challenge it is to get people to school. We are talking about Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, but Sarva doesn't apply to disabled people. You know, education for all, the term all has no meaning when you talk about disabled people, and we are not even aware of the magnitude of the challenge because we have not been gathering data about people's disability status for far too long. They also amplify the challenges that lie ahead, especially in view of the increase in life expectancy at birth and the disabling conditions that necessarily result from population aging. Perhaps it will be a useful starting point to consider the feasibility of enumerating in the 2021 census all the conditions that have been accorded recognition under the 2016 law on disability. That law, that is the 2016 law, specifies some 21 conditions which raising the number of impairments legally recognized under the 1995 law, it increases by threefold the number of disabilities that are recognized under the 2016 law. You remember we said 7 disabilities were recognized in the 1995 law. The current law that we have recognizes 21 conditions. That's a threefold increase. The newly added impairments include low vision, Down syndrome, intellectual disabilities, cerebral palsy, specific learning disabilities, muscular dystrophy, acid attack victims, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, speech and language disabilities, thalassemia, hemophilia, sickle cell disease. The last three are all, the previous 3 are all blood disorders, autism spectrum disorder, chronic neurological condition, multiple disabilities including deaf blind. So that makes it about 21. The 2016 law empowers the government. This is the other interesting point to bear in mind. The 2016 law also empowers government to accord legal status to any more conditions if the situation warrants. Following through on these commitments is imperative upon the Indian government in view of the ratification of the 27 UN Disabilities Convention in 2007. Now, can we have this slide that talks about the list of disabilities, please? I have listed only there the new disabilities that have been added under the 2016 Act. The first 7 of them were already listed when we discussed the 1995 Act. That was there in the separate slide. India's obligations to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, also vest additional responsibility on the government, industry and civil society. All the 17 goals, I am talking about the SDGs, all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are universal in ambition and envisage the inclusion of all their realization of all of them. That is for people regardless of disability, gender, and what you have, race, ethnicity, and everybody. Yeah. We are nearly done?
No, yeah.
Well, I'm nearly done. All I want to say towards the end is you have 7 goals. 5 of the 17 goals talk explicitly about disability, specifically attending to the needs of disabled people. One is education, then the second is on the reduction of inequalities, that is the inclusion of disabled people, political, social and economic inclusion, in the building of inclusive cities, that is the other goal that specifically mentions disabilities. And then you have in the collection of data and the monitoring of data, gathering of collecting, compiling disability disaggregated data is also one of the goals, and that's where also disability is mentioned very explicitly. I shall not go into the other sustainable development goals where disability doesn't figure directly, but surely it's mentioned obliquely, and we shall not go into those just now. So this is my case finally, that in the 2021 census we should look to ensure that more disabilities are canvassed than what we have so far, which should be consistent with those recognized under the 2016 law and the UN Convention on Disabilities. Thank you very much, and any questions, I'm more than happy to respond. Shmuk, can I have some water, please?
Yes, sir.
Now we can all have questions around so that.
So I've got 2 questions.
Yeah. Thank you.
So number 1, I understand that census is a massive exercise, very labor intensive. But the census data that is collected so far, and you were mentioning there's a huge variance with the data that has been given by organizations like WHO and UNDP.
Thanks.
Which is alarming because there's quite a discrepancy.
Yeah.
So does it mean that our enumerators are not doing their job properly? Because if the data is not correct, that means the government is not coming out with enough schemes or allocating enough resources to address this domain. So anything that the government has been able to figure out so that the corrections it makes now for the upcoming census and is able to get at least near accurate data. That is one, sir. My second question is something about these enumerators when they go. Do they also try to find out whether the differently able people have got themselves certified? Because I believe everywhere you need a certification, and the government mandates that the certification be provided to them. Because something about benchmark disability where 40% disability is required for some quota or reservation. So do the enumerators check on that also? Because they might get the numbers, but if people are not certified, they do not have that certification, they will have problems in getting access to all the schemes and facilities that the government has to offer. So is that something that the enumerators are doing in the census or not? So these are my 2 questions.
Thank you. To your first question, it's widely acknowledged that the data gathered by the census, the accuracy rate is somewhere in the region of 97-98%. The proportion of error is very minimal. So when I was talking about the comparative data from the global figures and the domestic figures, I might have conveyed the wrong impression, but the point I was making is the point I'm making is not that the disability figures in this country are low because the census enumeration process is not accurate, is not because of that. It's also not because the census enumerators are not doing their job. Now that we should be very, very clear about that, because as I said earlier, the accuracy rate is somewhere in some 97 and 98%. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it decade after decade, and it's the credibility of the Indian census is very high internationally. So that's one thing. But the reason why disabilities, the official disability figures are so low is because we have not been enumerating disability for a very long time, my dear friend. You know, from 1951, 61, 71, you didn't do it. You know, it takes a long time for even enumerators to appreciate, or even for people to be forthcoming to talk about these things. Only about 2 weeks back at the Hindu Lit Fest, there was a session on there's no shame talking about mental health, right? There was a session. There were two eminent people who were on the panel, and even the panelists, one of them I know pretty well, and even he was surprised at the turnout. There were a large number of people who were there in the audience, although the session was on the third floor of a building, but yet there were a large number of people. So I'm saying, you know, attitudes change, you know, people's attitudes, it takes time for people to make this mental shift, for families to take courage, talk about disability, you know. You know, so my short answer to your question is, disability figures are smaller because we have not been doing this for a long time. So that is a very important factor, and we have been enumerating only very few disabilities. As you saw, the difference between the increase in the number of disabled people from 2001 to 2011 was because, you know, you had more category and types of disabilities included, and people had this option of talking about any other disability that they have, or multiple disabilities. So you will see that if you have more disabilities enumerated in the next census, your numbers should go up. So it's nothing to do with the accuracy or the efficiency of the whole process. It's to do with whether the kind of questions we ask, the kind of information we want to gather. That's to answer number one. I hope it satisfies you.
Yes, sir.
Number two, hey, I need a little more water, please. The second, I'm not used to talking, you see. I sit in a small room there in the Hindu and corner, keep writing, you know, churning away some edits and things like that. So anyway, the answer to the second question is, what is the second question? Thanks.
The benchmark disability.
Yes, got it. Now the census, the business about the census is simply to enumerate, is simply to record what people have to say. The respondent is king there. You know, whatever they say goes, whatever they say counts, you know. And and the enumerator does not only does he not ask for your disability certificate, he does not ask for your age certificate. He does not ask whether you have a driving license. If you say I own a vehicle, you know, whether if I say I have a bank account, he doesn't want to scrutinize, check my bank passbooks and things like that. So that is not the business of the census. Those kind of minute, you know, testing and things like that probably happens elsewhere when you do the national sample surveys or somewhere else. But in a census, it's only what people say. And obviously, you know, people speak the truth. You know, we don't, it's sadly in our culture that I am guilty unless proved innocent, you know, but at least for the census, you know, the government thinks people are innocent unless they are proved guilty, you know. So people give information, you know. Government doesn't, enumerators do not check. If I say there are 10 people in my family, they don't check, they don't do a head count. It doesn't go like that. They talk to the head of the family, whether it's a woman or a man, and you know, that is how the process happens. So there is no verification of certificates of disability. You are right about the difficulties of obtaining a disability certificate to avail benefits and all that. but that's a separate question, that's a separate issue altogether. Yes.
Can I ask, you said that initially they left disability out of the whole census thing because the idea was that people are so ashamed or humiliated to have
Yep.
a person with disability, especially if it's a woman or a girl with
Right.
disability. They are kept
Thanks.
hidden indoors and
Thank you so much.
the family is afraid that nobody will marry the brother or
Yeah.
whatever. So is there anything being done to remove this stigma or anything to sort of give the family an incentive to expose the truth about the disabled person?
Well, as far as I know, I mean, you can't have, the only way, you're talking about attitudinal shifts, right? These are all attitudinal shifts you're talking about, whether somebody takes courage to say, his or her son or daughter is disabled or sibling is disabled. This is a question of one's comfort level.
Not just the individuals, but on a government scale.
No, that's what I'm coming to. But what can a government do? You are supposed, the government says, the Census Act says that people, you should participate in the census. You can't say no to the enumerator when it comes. It is an offense under the law, not to participate in the census, not to share data, things like that are there on paper, but these are not things you can implement. And I'm not sure that the government can do very much, but what the government can do, and I believe is doing, by enumerating disabilities year after year, decade after decade, and creating facilities for disabled people to move around, people on wheelchairs, people with hearing impairment, whether you have a sign language interpreter in our group here, if there was a person with a hearing impairment, if you create such kind of facilities for people to actually feel that they are welcome, despite their disability, by doing that you are indirectly but very positively helping families with disabled people to be more forthcoming, to lose their inhibitions, to feel more confident to talk about these situations. That's how it happens. I mean, this is the way I believe society and governments can help, personally somebody, close relatives who are more enlightened citizens can talk to families and say, this is a very important, exercise that goes on, and these are the benefits of this, so you should not feel afraid that your details are not going to be disclosed to anybody and everybody. There's confidentiality about this. That is what can change people's attitudes. And if people see more and more disabled people out and about on the roads, that people can wheel themselves around, on wheelchairs, etc., as it happens, say in Singapore, as it happens in European countries, as it happens in Japan, that is when things are really going to change for disabled people on the ground and for their caregivers on the ground.
Why was the colonial government interested in disability?
That's a very interesting question.
Of all the issues?
Well, to begin with, they were, the colonial administration, they were always thirsty for information, not in their own self-interest, not because, not after hearing Shashi Tharoor's lecture on, what the colonial administration do to India. I cannot bring myself to saying that, they had benevolent motives about this. But they must have done, gathered information on disability. They did so on about blind people, people who cannot, people with locomotor impairments, possibly also about hearing impairments, one or two like that. not very much else. Basically, to I think to understand the to see what kind of a what proportion of people were left behind, and things like that. I mean, I can only speculate, but
Probably it was also part of the epidemiological interest, because colonial government was responsible for things like ophthalmic services, disease prevention.
yes, in fact, I think that makes sense. I mean, the dominant model of understanding disabilities was the medical model.
Yeah, yeah,
So if I'm blind, that means I'm unhealthy.
yeah.
It has to do with finding a cure for blindness.
Part of the larger scheme.
Ah.
I mean, to a considerable extent, that was true also that time, because malnutrition was its highest. Probably pregnant women never had vitamin A, and the children would have born blind.
And the march of democracy was, the idea of equal opportunities was simply non-existent, you see.
Non-existent.
That was not part of the political vocabulary.
Correct.
Because you are trying to they were still not giving women the vote. Universal adult suffrage becomes a reality only in the early part of the 20th century.
Correct.
So it was simply unthinkable that it was disabilities had anything to do with the democratic enlightened process.
Or distribution of justice.
Yeah, none of that.
None of that.
None of that whatsoever.
Any more? Yeah. Okay, so that's a fantastic evening.